Monkey's Paw. A moral short story by William Wymark Jacobs. A small family is living at a small town in England. They are Mr. and Mrs. White, and their grown-up son named Herbert. One day they are visited by Sergeant Major Morris, who is a very close friend. Sergeant Major Morris had served with the British Army in India. During supper, he introduces them to a strange thing. It is a mummified monkey's paw. He has told the family that an old priest had placed a curse spell on the monkey's paw. The paw has magical powers. It would grant 3 wishes to a person, but only with hellish consequences as punishment in return for tampering with fate. Sergeant Major Morris, having had a horrible experience in the past after using the paw, throws it into the fire intending to destroy it. However, the skeptical Mr. White retrieves the paw from the fire to prevent it from getting destroyed. Morris becomes very surprised, and before leaving, Morris warns Mr. White of what might happen should he use the cursed paw. Later on, Mr. White is discussing the story to his family and thinking what they should do with the monkey's paw. His wife and son encourage Mr. White to test out Morris's theory concerning the curse related to monkey's paw. Herbert told him that he just never believes in prejudice or fairy tales. What harm could have had happened to them anyway? Herbert also told his father to ask for something small, and if things work out well, then they can ask for greater fortunes. At that moment, greed can be seen all over Herbert's eyes. Although Mr. White hesitates at first, believing that he already has everything he wants. Nevertheless, at Herbert's suggestion and pressure, Mr. White carelessly wishes for £200, which will enable him to make the final mortgage payment for his house. When he makes his wish, Mr. White suddenly drops the paw in surprise and fear, claiming that it has moved and twisted like a snake. Herbert starts laughing by saying his father has become really weak and scared due to his old age. Mrs. White comforts her husband that it is all just an illusion, as nothing bad will happen. She insists him of taking rest or sleep to clear his mind from superstitions. The following day, Herbert leaves for work in a factory where he operates big machines. Herbert has not returned from work on time, which has got the parents worried. Later on, at that night, an employee arrives at the Whites' home, telling them that Herbert had been killed in a terrible machine accident that had mutilated his body. The company denies any responsibility for the incident, but declares its intention to make a goodwill payment to the mourning family. Then the despairing couple asks what the amount of the money will be from the company. To their greatest surprise, the employee told the company is willing to give £200. From that moment onwards, Mrs. White was constantly grieving and crying, and the couple barely talked with each other. A few days after Herbert's funeral, when Mr. White returns back from work in the evening, Mrs. White, mad with grief, insists that her husband use the paw to wish her son Herbert back to life. Mr. White refuses at first by explaining the shocking accident had mutilated Herbert in such a horrible state that it would be disturbing to see him inside the coffin, let alone seeing him alive in person right now. He rejects her proposal, which had angered Mrs. White so much so that she asked him whether has he ever loved Herbert or not. If he does not listen to her, then she will leave him for good. Reluctantly, Mr. White asks for second wish from the monkey's paw to bring his son back to life, despite great unease at the thought of summoning his son's mutilated and decomposing body. Later that night, there are continuous violent and loud knocks at the door, and it feels like the door will be crashed by the thing outside which was causing such ruckus. As Mrs. White runs to the downstairs in the dark while shouting repeatedly, "Who is at the door?" There is no response from a human but a loud screech from a monster or dead corpse. Mrs. White struggles at the locks in a desperate attempt to open the door. Mr. White becomes terrified and fears that the thing or monster outside is not the son he loved. He believed if his wife lets that mutilated thing inside of their house, undoubtedly it would bring great misfortune, misery, and curse to their life. Out of extreme terror and anxiety, he grabs the monkey's paw and desperately makes his third and final wish so that the monster outside the door can disappear. The wish was granted, and the knocking stops suddenly. After a while, Mrs. White successfully opens the door to find that no one is there. She bursts into tears, and Mr. White runs downstairs with a lamp to check on Mrs. White. He hugs her gently to calm her down and whispers in her ears, "Whatever has happened at the end has happened for a good reason." After some time, Mrs. White stops crying and both of them locks the door. Mr. White starts preparing some tea so that both of them can relax while drinking in front of the fireplace. Both of them were hoping to forget what has happened just a while ago, but doubt remains in their mind. Will they ever be able to forget? Moral lesson of this story: do not tempt the fate, and be careful what you wish for.